Tonight, on the 243rd anniversary of the Battle of Groton Heights, we'll investigate an aspect of the battle that we haven't really talked about for 25 years, perhaps because it has been such a controversial subject. I grew up on Fort Griswold, and I've always known that analyzing the death of Colonel William Ledyard was a touchy subject for some. In fact, the last time somebody publicly questioned it, he was met with what he described as skepticism and occasional hostility. Now, hostility is a strong word, and I'll give you the details on that incident a little bit later. But that was 25 years ago, and ever since then, modern history books have begun to critically analyze Ledyard's death, with three suggesting that he wasn't killed with a sword to the chest upon surrendering, as society has long believed, but rather that he was more likely bayoneted to death on the battlefield. Now, there's evidence to support that theory, and the historical revision of Colonel Ledyard's demise has actually been slowly underway for quite some time now. But it's a long road, as we'll see. Now, speaking about questions of Colonel Ledyard's death in battle, in a 2001 Hartford Courant article, Connecticut historian and author George Dudley Seymour said, "Controversy is the fuel which keeps the fires burning on the altar of history. The main job of any group that hopes to support a historic site must be to feed the fires, fan the flames, and to encourage new inquiry into old deeds and demigods. Engagement is what makes people care about a place." Now, any historian would agree with that advice. Now, Seymour knew history's handling of Colonel Ledyard was kind of haunted by a lot of questions, and he was encouraging us to talk about it. And that's what we're doing tonight. We're encouraging new inquiry into old deeds. But it's a complicated situation, and I'll let you decide for yourself as we wander through the haziness of it all. Many of you are probably familiar with the expansive 12-foot high by 16-foot long colorful mural installed in the lobby of the City of Groton Municipal building that depicts the death of Colonel Ledyard. It's an original, beautiful painting by Connecticut artist David Wagner, who gifted it to the city in 1981 for the 200th anniversary of the battle. The mural depicts British Major Stephen Bromfield having just removed a sword from the body of Colonel Ledyard, who was falling to the ground here with a bloody, fatal wound in the middle of his chest. This illustrates the centuries-old common belief that once the victorious British won Fort Griswold, Bromfield strode through the gate with his aides while the massacre of the defenders was underway. Colonel Ledyard allegedly marched toward Bromfield, raising and lowering his sword as a symbol of his intent to surrender. Bromfield supposedly demanded, "Who commands this fort?" To which Ledyard answered, "I did, sir, but you do now," as he presented his sword to Bromfield hilt first. Bromfield then reportedly accepted the sword and plunged it through Ledyard's chest, killing him. So our long-accepted tale has three main components: a verbal exchange, a surrender, and a sword plunged through the chest of Colonel Ledyard front to back. Now, as you hear the testimony tonight, remember that this story occurred in a chaotic combat environment. Survivors said they were outnumbered 6-1 as hundreds of British swarmed into the fort's small interior. It was dense with smoke, packed full of men fighting, running for their lives. The scene was full of visual and oral distractions. One visitor described the scene as a horrid scene of carnage that no words could describe. So the killing of Colonel Ledyard occurred during pretty much life or death pandemonium. And that certainly contributed to the confusion over how he was actually killed. Now, John Adams was aware of man's tendency to exaggerate. After the War of Independence, he said, "The history of our revolution will be one continued lie from one end to the other." And of course, we the people proved him right on many fronts, as patriotism and memorials to our founders and the fallen have often inspired us to glorify things at times. Now, historian James Loewen wrote a book called "Lies My Teacher Told Me." One of many such books that now tell us that many of those heartwarming patriotic tales we learned in school were simply not true. And we've seen the result of the the deception, as statues have fallen across the country, and even in our area, the Columbus statue was removed from New London, and John Mason's statue was run out of Groton. So when we consider Colonel Ledyard's death, we have to consider the prevalence of even well-intentioned embellishment in American history, because it was this habit of ours that caused the controversy of Ledyard's death in the first place. After reading enough of the history of Fort Griswold and the killing of Colonel Ledyard, I eventually came to view the common tale of Ledyard's surrender and death by his own sword as more of a patriotic urban legend than a factual event. The questions and contradictions surrounding Ledyard's death are many, beginning as far back as 1870, and after an extended quiet period, resurfacing around 1975. Now, to avoid a lot of repetition tonight, I'll often refer to the surrender and sword through the chest story as the legend. Okay? And I'll refer to Bromfield's demand, who commands this fort, and Ledyard's response, I did, sir, but you do now, as the verbal exchange. It'll be a lot easier. Now, early evidence of the intentional shaping of the story of Colonel Ledyard's death began just a day after the battle, when Groton merchant Thomas Mumford returned from Hartford to inspect the burnt ruins of his home. Governor Jonathan Trumbull had asked Mumford to report back about the tragedy on Fort Griswold. He said, especially about the treatment of Colonel Ledyard and the unfortunate garrison, for such improvement as may be hereafter thought proper. So Governor Trumbull fully expected to embellish the event, not only to properly honor the fallen, he also had a strategy to promote a propaganda campaign against the British that might fuel more anger and help with Connecticut's difficult recruitment efforts for both the militias and the Continental Army. It's likely that the first detail Governor Trumbull received was in a letter on September 7th from Colonel Zabdiel Rogers. Rogers was commander of the 20th Regiment of Connecticut Militia from Norwich, and he responded with his regiment from Norwich to New London. But by the time he got there, the British had destroyed the town and were already retreating. So Rogers actually arrived in New London several hours after Colonel Ledyard was killed. Yet, Rogers wrote to Trumbull saying that after Ledyard surrendered, the enemy murdered him and a number of others. But of course, Rogers was never in Groton, so his statements are unreliable. Why he even wrote to Trumbull remains a question. Still, he never mentions the dramatic verbal exchange that we know today, nor a sword through the chest. The enemy simply murdered Ledyard along with a number of others. Meanwhile, Thomas Mumford wrote to Governor Trumbull. Mumford said that Ledyard thought proper to surrender himself with the garrison prisoners and presented his sword to an officer who received the same and immediately lunged in through the brave commandant when the ruffians, no doubt by order, pierced him in many places with bayonets. Now, Mumford, who also wasn't at the battle, didn't say who told him that story. Oddly, the 7 battle survivors who filed depositions at that same time never mentioned the killing of Ledyard at all. As we'll see, no one saw Colonel Ledyard actually surrender. And his vest reveals a major flaw in Mumford's story. Yet even though Mumford's story lacked credibility from the start, the legend's act of surrender was born, and the sword through the chest, though insinuated, was also born just days after the Battle of Groton Heights. And perhaps pointedly, Mumford also never said anything about the verbal exchange. Now, Mumford's story suited Trumbull's plans so perfectly, he gave the information to the Connecticut Current and Weekly Intelligencer, a paper at the time, and they published it immediately. From there, the story spread quickly as other newspapers reprinted it, and their editors also dressed it up a bit as they saw fit to sell the newspapers. Then anonymous letters began appearing in American newspapers, introducing new information with no sources at all. This is where the verbal exchange and the idea that Ledyard was killed with his own sword first appeared. None of it heard or seen by an eyewitness, and the letter writers were never identified. Now, most newer history books on the battle after 2000 acknowledge the creative writing that occurred directly after the battle. historians pretty much agree with Eric Lehman, author of Homegrown Terror, Benedict Arnold and the Burning of New London. Lehman says that Ledyard's story quickly became exaggerated with a final dialogue invented. The dialogue and the courteous way Ledyard surrendered became great propaganda for the American press. Though considerable evidence to the contrary existed at the time, it seems these distortions remain the preferred history of the event for almost 2 centuries. Over time, part of the legend became literally written in stone here in Groton, and it exists in many other forms as well. Words assuming that Ledyard was killed by his own sword upon surrendering are carved into the granite of Colonel Ledyard's grave monument in Colonel Ledyard Cemetery, which was installed 73 years after his death, and on the marker on Fort Griswold designating where Ledyard fell, which was placed 122 years after the battle. Both indicators that the legend had lived on for years. Now, the bronze plaque on the fort's memorial gates, that was installed at the same time as the marker, includes an image of Colonel Ledyard surrendering his sword hilt first. And the verbal exchange is written down below in homage to the legend. And there are informational signs installed at the fort that claim when Ledyard surrendered his sword to the British commanding officer, the officer ran Ledyard through with his own sword, per the legend. And as we'll see, there's not a lot of solid proof for that. In addition to these physical representations, speakers at events today, you still hear them relating the verbal exchange. It's been such a tale in the area, that in the sword through the chest. And of course, the Wagner mural has told basically that same story now for over 40 years. There was even a commemorative plate issued by the Daughters of the American Revolution in 1908 depicting the surrender of Colonel Ledyard based on pretty much conjecture. And I'm sure there are other such representations. So well into the 1900s, the community still embraced the legend of Colonel Ledyard's death, though it was fairly unsubstantiated at the time. A lot of the facts were far from clear. Historian William Wallace Harris is buried right here in Cedar Grove Cemetery in New London. Harris first wrote about the haziness of Ledyard's killing back in 1870. His book was published in New London, and Harris gave it an unwieldy title. It was called The Battle of Groton Heights, a collection of narratives, official reports, etc., of the storming of Fort Griswold and the burning of New London by British troops under the command of Brigadier General Benedict Arnold on the 6th of September, 1781. In it, Harris says, no person who actually witnessed the deed survived the battle, the deed being Ledyard's killing. Or if any did, they left no account of it behind them. And therefore, the version of the manner of Ledyard's death commonly received as the correct one is but merely a conjecture at the most. That was his analysis. Now remember, this was 90 years after the battle. Plenty of time for more reliable information to be uncovered, but it never was. To his credit, Charles Allen thought enough of Harris's analysis to include it in his significant history, The Battle of Groton Heights, which was published in 1882, 12 years after Harris's book. Harris seems to have been the first public challenger of the legend, since Allen wrote that certainly no one raised such a question during the lifetime of the defenders. But Harris's opinion didn't really matter because he was pretty much ignored for another century. Now, because, as Harris said, there were no reliable witnesses to the killing of Colonel Ledyard, the contradictions in the historical record suggest any number of possible scenarios concerning how Ledyard met his fate. He could have been killed with his own sword upon surrendering, as we thought. He might have been attacked from the side after surrendering, and we'll certainly talk more about that later. He could have been run through with a bayonet, not a sword. He might have been killed while defending himself in battle. There's a possibility he was unrecognized and anonymously killed in the chaotic massacre that was going on in the fort's interior. Two witnesses at one time claimed he was simply unceremoniously killed while asking for mercy with the others. All of these options have been mentioned at one time or another, yet the patriotic version of the legend kept them under wraps for quite a while after the battle. Historians began to gently question the legend around 1975 in various publications, but they too were routinely ignored, just as Harris had been. Then, almost 25 years later, the controversy entered the public arena in 1999 via a program presented by Dr. Walter Powell titled Murder or Mayhem, The Strange Death of Colonel Ledyard. Now, Dr. Powell is the author of Murder or Mayhem, Benedict Arnold's New London, Connecticut Raid in 1781, which was published in 2000, just after the program. At the time of the program, he was Director of Planning and Historic Preservation for the borough of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. Now, until recently, he served as Director of the Plymouth, Massachusetts Antiquarian Society. He still serves on the Society's board and speaks extensively on historical subjects. Now, one chapter of his book seriously questions the long-accepted story of Ledyard's death and provided the basis for that program, which was held at the Groton Municipal building. It resulted in a rare but telling public display of the controversy. The community still believed, of course, in the legend. In 1999, with 150 people in attendance, Powell staged a mock trial of the British officers involved, asking the audience to act as jurors. The goal was to consider whether the British officers could be convicted by trial in Colonel Ledyard's death based on available evidence. After hearing the evidence, the audience acquitted the British officers, which of course questioned the legitimacy of the long-accepted tale of Ledyard's dramatic surrender and killing. Now, after the program, Dr. Norman Boas, former president of the Stonington Historical Society, accused Powell of attempting to erroneously rewrite history. He claimed that a newspaper article from 1781 was an unquestionable confirmation of the crime, and though it was clearly not. Richard White, author of Jordan Freeman Was My Friend, attacked Dr. Powell in a letter in the day, questioning his credibility. He called Powell's testimony vapid vaporings. He was an English teacher, I think, or meaningless words. Now, White also suggested that if Powell's audience would read the Fort Griswold narratives for themselves, they would be convinced of the manner of Colonel Ledyard's death. Powell responded in the day that those narratives were fraught with error and contradiction, something Boas and White readily ignored in their defense of the legend. Now, both of these men were prime examples of the public's patriotic allegiance to the legend, despite the evidence that was available. Dr. Powell heard other disparaging remarks from locals in the following days before he left Groton. He was surprised that historical fact could be so ill-received. There's a new book published just last month. It was written by Matthew Reardon, and it's called The Traitor's Homecoming, Benedict Arnold's Raid on New London, Connecticut, to September 4 to 13, 1781. I believe it is the definitive history of the Battle of Groton Heights. The book's introduction is written by none other than Dr. Powell. He mentions in his introduction, he says, "I had frequent occasion to give lectures on this topic, often greeted by the public with skepticism and occasional hostility." So Dr. Powell remembers to this day the hostility he experienced 25 years ago for questioning the legend. Now think about that. 129 years after Harris essentially debunked the legend, in 1870 there were still adamant protectors of the common tale that was by then known to many to be based on a lot of conjecture. Another indication of controversy occurred when a forensics expert met with considerable resistance years ago when he suggested DNA testing of Colonel Ledyard's sword and garments as a means to seek the truth. But his suggestion didn't go over well, and the matter was abruptly dropped. So there certainly has been controversy over how Colonel Ledyard died on Fort Griswold. Now let's look at the evidence to see why. The story of Ledyard's killing derives mostly from narratives, letters, and depositions filed after the battle and the physical evidence of Ledyard's clothing. The tale gained traction from the start with Trumbull's dissemination of Mumford's letter and through subsequent embellished newspaper accounts and pamphlets and history books, word of mouth, and so on. Until about the year 2000, most historians' reiteration of the legend stemmed from two main narratives that society kind of embraced as gospel, readily ignoring the issues with each. Both of these narratives told conflicting tales on different occasions, yet they were heralded pretty much as the historical foundation of Colonel Ledyard's patriotic demise. Now, Rufus Avery was 23 years old in 1781. He lived to be 64 years of age. Avery's first testimony says he saw Colonel Ledyard on the parade marching toward the enemy, raising and lowering his sword, signaling his intent to surrender. Avery then saw Ledyard move to about 6 or 8 feet from the British officer in charge. But he then says, "At that moment, I turned my eyes from Ledyard and stepped up to the door of the barrack and saw the enemy discharging their guns through the windows. I turned myself immediately about, and the enemy had executed Colonel Ledyard in less time than 1 minute after I saw him." Now, Avery later wrote to Governor Trumbull saying, "Then the enemy rushed in, came to one of our men. He asked them for quarters, whereupon they damned him and put him to death. Likewise, Colonel Ledyard fared his fate in the same manner." So Avery first said he saw Colonel Ledyard surrendering but didn't see him killed, and later he said he saw Ledyard being put to death while asking for mercy along with the others. So neither Avery nor Rogers mentioned the verbal exchange nor a sword through the chest. It seems historian Harris, who said there were no eyewitnesses, didn't view Avery as a reliable witness since he changed his story, perhaps. First he didn't see Ledyard killed, and then he did. Now, Governor Trumbull reported on the event to George Washington using Mumford's version, yet he acknowledged that the surrender and killing were unauthenticated at that time. Stephen Hempstead lived for another 50 years after the battle, and he was involved in the battle. He died in 1831 at 77 years of age. As an interesting side note, some of you may have seen the framed copy of Hempstead's narrative in the Shack restaurant there in Groton by the front door inside. I haven't asked him about that yet, but it's hanging there. Now, in his deposition right after the battle, Hempstead said, "The British put to death Colonel Ledyard, our commander, and a great number of other officers and soldiers of the garrison while they were begging for quarter." Similar to what Avery had said. So first, Hempstead agrees with one of Avery's assertions. Then, in a later letter to Governor Trumbull, he described the massacre but said nothing of Colonel Ledyard's death. Now, months later, in a sworn deposition before a judge, he stated the enemy chased him and others into the magazine where he was run through with a bayonet. He made no mention of Ledyard's surrender or the verbal exchange in those early written remarks about the battle. Now, 45 years later, in 1826, when Hempstead was 72 years old, he told a news story to a St. Louis, Missouri newspaper where he then lived, saying, and I quote, "At this moment, the renegade Colonel Beckwith commanding cried out, 'Who commands this garrison?' Colonel Ledyard, who was standing near me, answered, 'I did, sir, but you do now,' at the same time stepping forward, handing him his sword with the point towards himself. At this instant, I perceived a soldier in the act of bayoneting me from behind. So I turned," this is Hempstead still talking, "I turned suddenly around and grabbed his bayonet, endeavoring to unship it and knock off the thrust, but in vain. Having but one hand, he succeeded in forcing it into my right hip above the joint and just below the abdomen and crushed me to the ground. The first person I saw afterwards was my brave commander, a corpse by my side, having been run through the body with his own sword by the savage renegade." So now the verbal exchange appears in Hempstead's narrative decades after the battle, and he is now bayoneted next to Colonel Ledyard, not in the magazine as earlier stated. So almost half a century later, Hempstead seems to have readily adapted the various embellished newspaper accounts and anonymous letters by people who weren't even at the battle. And we'll talk about aging memories in a bit. Now, in his defense, Hempstead said his account appeared in several newspapers, none of which I think he said are wholly correct, insinuating the newspaper embellished his story, as was the habit at the time. Also questioning Hempstead's and others' integrity was an 1847 Hartford Courant article about the battle, where the journalist reported that among the many papers in the state library, it is remarkable that I have as yet discovered not one which speaks of a surrender by Colonel Ledyard. Concerning Hempstead's multiple versions, Dr. Powell asked in a Hartford Courant article, which account do you believe? The one he gave shortly after the battle in front of a judge, or the one he gave 50 years later? So in spite of all this, history fully embraced pretty much Hempstead's newspaper account 45 years after the battle, ignoring the fact that neither he nor Avery actually saw Ledyard being killed. Hempstead had been exposed to decades of various versions of Ledyard's death, and his 1826 embellished account is likely a combination of them all. And his later version seems to have gone on to strengthen the influence of the many false or unsubstantiated aspects of Ledyard's killing. And that carried over into history books for many years, like Charles Allen's Battle of Groton Heights and others. Now, Charles Allen likely researched his book in the 1860s and 70s. Remember, it was published in 1882. By that time, his first-hand witnesses had all died years before. Now, since none of them had filed a timely deposition, Allen spoke with their descendants long after the battle, relying on their third-party testimony, which he seemed to readily believe. Now, these were aging men who had honed their stories over a period of 55 to 74 years after the battle, and 6 to 29 years after Hempstead's new story appeared in newspapers around the country. And it must be said that some of these gentlemen were applying for government pensions at the time for their wartime service and were out to kind of prove that they had been in battle. So considerable time, age, and outside influences bring suspicion to their stories, most of which resemble Hempstead's newer version of events in one way or another. Interestingly, some of these narrators who survived the battle are not listed on the fort's plaque as participants, whether as prisoners or escapees. Now, one of Allen's participants was a gentleman named Japhet Mason, 39 years old in 1781. Mason claimed he was standing near Stephen Hempstead at the time of the killing of Colonel Ledyard. Allen said Mason saw it as described. When Mason saw there would be no mercy, he fled, and he's noted on the fort's plaque as an escapee. Allen doesn't say what saw it as described means. Remember, Hempstead's first description said that Colonel Ledyard was put to death with a great number of others while they were begging for quarters, for mercy. And later he said he was chased into the magazine where he was bayoneted. So saw it as described could mean one of Hempstead's earlier versions or the embellished newspaper accounts published shortly after the battle. Mason neglected to file a deposition, and he died just 6 years later, so we don't know what stories he told his descendants, whom Allen interviewed over 80 years after Mason had died. So though he could have been a valuable witness, his testimony is rendered rather worthless by its lack of detail and the far-removed, unreliable third-party status of the testimony. Allen thought the recollections of these various descendants long after the battle provided proof beyond a reasonable doubt of Ledyard's death, which was ironic considering that Allen himself admitted in his book that time had caused careless renditions and corrupted the truth of the Fort Griswold narratives. Now, considering the long gap between the battle and the later narratives, to be true to history, we have to consider the problems with stories of aging men. I can attest to that myself, actually. The National Institute of Health says that age renders human memory untrustworthy, as there exists a common human psychological tendency to make our exploits a little more dramatic as we age. Many of the narratives that mention Ledyard's killing had been developed for decades after the battle. By the time most survivors finally recorded their stories, many had spent years of their lives embellishing the experiences, especially after being exposed to Hempstead's final version. Theirs came out much after that. Psychologists say that our memories are not concerned with historical accuracy, and any bits of information that is acquired later simply gets woven into the fabric of memory as though they'd always been there. Now, the Connecticut Historical Society recognized this problem back in 1975, admitting in a bulletin that the countless tragedies, shocking enough in their impact then, became distorted or magnified in the retelling as time passed. Yet in spite of it all, this is 75, but in spite of it all, patriotism kept the legend alive. But fortunately, in addition to narratives, we also have interesting physical evidence. We still have Colonel Ledyard's vest and shirt at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History in Hartford, the former Connecticut Historical Society. These are the same garments that Ledyard wore on the day he was killed. And of course, his sword is right here in front of us. These artifacts remain the only true, reliable witnesses to Ledyard's death, and the vest tells an interesting story. The vest has two jagged cuts, one on either side below the armholes. Both the vest and the shirt display vague, now faint bloodstains on either side, not the front or the back. I had to lighten this image a little bit, but I can tell you the stains are far more apparent in person. William Harris noted long ago that there is no hole from a blade in the front nor on the back of the vest. Strange, he thought, if Ledyard was run through front to back. Now, this led Harris to critically analyze the problematic sword handling sequence of Ledyard's supposed surrender and killing. Harris claimed the larger of these apertures is upon the left side. The difference in size between it and that on the right corresponds with the taper of a saber blade from hilt to point, showing conclusively that the weapon entered from the left and passed out at the right, and that the person by whom the wound was inflicted must have stood upon the left of the wearer when the plunge was made. He says Bromfield no doubt would have entered the dangerous, chaotic environment of the fort's interior with his sword drawn. So if Bromfield was right-handed, as most people are, he would have been holding it in his right hand as Ledyard surrendered. Now, if Bromfield was planning to execute Ledyard, he would have wanted to accept Ledyard's sword in his strong hand. So he would have had to move his own sword to his weaker hand before accepting Ledyard's sword in his strong right hand to allow him a firm plunge into Ledyard's chest. Or he might have accepted Ledyard's sword with his weak left hand and killed Ledyard with his own sword instead. Harris considered it unlikely that Bromfield would have run the sword through Ledyard using his weak hand. Yet this very scenario is depicted here in the Wagner mural. Bromfield is shown as being left-handed based on his sword scabbard on his right side there. Harris thought that was a little improbable. He believed it highly unlikely that Bromfield would have moved his own sword to his weaker hand to accept Ledyard's sword with his prominent hand. This, of course, refutes the fact that upon surrendering, Ledyard was killed with his own sword. Harris also claimed that to create the two side tears in the vest, Bromfield would have had to have repositioned himself to Ledyard's left side, a highly unlikely scenario. But of course, who's to say Ledyard didn't turn quickly to his right for some reason with all the commotion going on, and Bromfield lunged toward him, resulting in Bromfield running the blade through Ledyard's left side. In his History of the Town of Ledyard, 1650 to 1900, published over a century after the battle, Reverend John Avery says that a granddaughter of Caleb Avery who was at the battle, wrote to him, stating she often heard grandmother, aunt, and father recount how Ledyard presented his sword to Bromfield, whereupon Bromfield seized the sword and plunged it through Ledyard's heart, driving it through the body from the left armpit to the right. This is the only account, really, that I've seen yet that attempts to match the killing of Colonel Ledyard to the evidence of the vest. Of course, we have to recognize that this is the granddaughter of Caleb Avery, now 2 generations removed from the actual participant himself. Plus, it involves the physical awkwardness of a side thrust that Harris described. Now, William Harris addressed the side thrust by saying it made more sense to consider that someone other than Bromfield actually killed the colonel. Harris also claimed that since this transaction, Ledyard's killing, there has ever existed in the public mind great uncertainty as to who was the murderer of Colonel Ledyard. He shed suspicion on Captain George Beckwith, the officer who accompanied Major Bromfield as they marched through the fort's gate. Harris claimed Beckwith was furious, filled with rage, he said, at the unexpected British losses by such a ragtag garrison, including high-ranking officers like Major Montgomery. Beckwith could easily have killed Ledyard from the side as Bromfield and Ledyard interacted, if indeed they did interact. Now, I suppose we can't rule out that Bromfield could have accepted Ledyard's sword with his weak hand, as depicted in the Wagner mural, and handed it to his right to Beckwith, who may have stood to Ledyard's left. From there, Beckwith could have run the colonel's own sword through his vest, left to right. However, we have to remember that no one saw any of this. It was all assumed. In fact, some historians claim Colonel Ledyard was more likely killed not by a sword, but by a bayonet. Remember that Rufus Avery had said the enemy rushed in, came to one of our men, he asked him for quarters, they damned him, put him to death, and likewise, Colonel Ledyard fared his fate in the same manner. Dr. Powell claimed in his book that from Avery's letter, it appears Colonel Ledyard was bayoneted with several other men while begging for quarter. This seems all the more probable in light of Hempstead's early statement in his deposition that after the garrison surrendered, the British put to death Colonel Ledyard, our commander, and a great number of other officers and soldiers of the garrison while they were begging for quarter. Now, put to death insinuates by bayonet the most preferred alternative versus wasting valuable ammunition. Powell adds that the vest tears equally suggest that he might have been killed by a thrust from a triangular bladed bayonet of the type carried by most British soldiers on their Brown Bess muskets. Now, almost 45 years ago now, in their book, September 6, 1781, North Groton Story, Carolyn Smith and Helen Ferguson state, the 2 rents in his vest were more like those made by a bayonet. And last time I checked, the Connecticut Historical Society's website also acknowledged that other evidence suggests Ledyard may have died from a bayonet wound instead. So there's a few different versions or beliefs out there. Most modern histories agree with the single bayonet theory, or sometimes 2 stabs with the same blade. In 2020's Alamo of the Revolution, Benedict Arnold and the Massacre of Fort Griswold, Gerald Hurwitz says, physical evidence supports the conclusion that Ledyard was killed by 2 bayonet thrusts delivered below his armpits along the side seams of his waistcoat. Now, Matt Reardon's deeply researched book, it's called The Traitor's Homecoming, also supports the death by bayonet theory, claiming Ledyard was killed while defending himself. Reardon says Ledyard was walking toward the British officers to surrender when a redcoat, who apparently didn't recognize him, went after him and thrust his bayonet at him. Ledyard instinctively turned his body to the left to avoid it, possibly even swinging his sword towards his attacker. As he turned, the British soldier made a second thrust and drove his bayonet into the colonel just below the armpit, puncturing his lungs and heart and killing him almost instantly. Now, this corresponds directly with a Hartford Courant article from 2001, wherein the Connecticut Historical Society surmised that Since the ruffled shirt that Ledyard wore beneath the waistcoat has a tear in the back with no corresponding tear in the front, this would indicate that the shirt was twisted under his waistcoat. And Ledyard was very active when he was run through, probably defending himself. Those were their words. Now, another version of the bayonet theory comes from several narratives and histories that mention Ledyard being killed by multiple bayonet strikes, some saying brutalized by bayonets. But looking at the vest with only 2 holes, it's hard to imagine such a thing. Brutalized insinuates many wounds, some of which would surely have been inflicted in the torso through the vest, so you'd think the vest would have a lot more holes than it does. And remember Thomas Mumford, early on, he claimed Ledyard was run through upon surrendering, and then the ruffians pierced him in many places with bayonets. So the multiple bayonet theory was mentioned in various publications in the late 1800s, including Francis Cawkin's History of New London. But nobody seemed to really notice. You know, in any event, looking at the vest today, the theory of multiple bayonet wounds doesn't quite ring true. Now, in spite of Harris's criticisms in 1870, many still supported the patriotic surrender and sword through the chest story. A string of local history books simply reiterated the preferred version of the legend, often including the unsubstantiated verbal exchange. There was Charles Allen's Battle of Groton Heights, Francis Cawkin's History of New London, Charles Stark's Groton, Connecticut, Carol Kimball's The Groton Story, and there's also many compilation books, like Arthur Soderlund's book on Connecticut, and countless articles that cut and paste the common story from these and other sources. And of course, a lot of speakers today still support the legend. It wasn't until around 1975 that historians began to openly challenge the legend in print, perhaps beginning with that Connecticut Historical Society booklet in 1975 that I mentioned earlier. Following that came September 6, 1781, North Groton Story. They supported the bayonet option. Dr. Walter Powell's book, published in 2000. The current articles, Eric Lehman's book, Alamo with the Revolution, they all supported bayonets. And of course, Matthew Reardon's recent book also supports death by bayonet and not sword. A couple of years ago, even high schoolers got into the act when the Colonel News, the Ledyard High School newspaper, did an article on all the various questionable facets of the legend. So the next generation is showing an interest, I think, for truth and history. So you'll notice that except for William Harris's analysis, legend supporters and legend critics our 2 distinct groups seem to be separated by a specific year. Legend supporters existed before 1975, and legend critics came out after 1975 and continue to this year. It's interesting and telling that Dr. Powell caught some abuse in 1999, 25 years after the questioning began. So some still didn't want to believe the patriotic tale not to be true. And no one has ever really written, at least not recently, in support of the legend for the past 50 years or so, though plenty have questioned it. But can we ever really know for sure what happened to Colonel Ledyard, considering all this? Now, no modern discussion of the circumstances of Colonel Ledyard's death would be complete without talking about forensic testing. Years ago, Connecticut's famous forensics expert, Dr. Henry Lee, said that DNA evidence could likely remain on the colonel's vest, shirt, and maybe a sword, since DNA can survive for thousands of years. But at the same time, I think we have to consider what's to be gained from forensic testing. We might learn whether it was indeed Colonel Ledyard's sword that made the holes in his vest or some other blade. Which would still leave us wondering whether it might have been Bromfield or Beckwith's sword, or an anonymous bayonet that actually killed him. The vest already tells us pretty much unequivocally that the sword through the chest theory is not true, nor apparently are the tales of Ledyard being brutalized with bayonets. Plus, forensic testing, would depend on the depth of our community's interest in the pursuit of that level of truth. So until that happens, what do we really know about Colonel Ledyard, how Colonel Ledyard was killed? We know there were no credible witnesses that survived the battle. No early depositions mention a verbal exchange or surrender by Colonel Ledyard. Governor Trumbull was intent on embellishing the event and readily passed along his unsubstantiated accounts to newspapers. Early on, Mumford and Rogers mentioned a surrender, but neither one was there, and neither one revealed their sources. Mumford hinted at a sword in the chest with Bromfield's lunge, but lost credibility when he said Ledyard was then bayoneted in many places, which the vest clearly denies. I think anonymous letters, we know, were to the newspapers were the first to give us the verbal exchange. And Hempstead's newspaper account came out 45 years after the Battle of Groton Heights. And then, of course, all the other narratives appeared long after the battle, some up to 74 years later, all after Hempstead's story had hit the papers. And we know that since 1975, and especially after 2000, modern historians have been seriously questioning the legend. So no reliable witness heard the verbal exchange or saw the surrender or saw Ledyard being run through with any sword, whether his own or somebody else's. And many have believed since 1975, now 50 years ago, that he was bayoneted on the battlefield. However, without forensic testing, it seems that in this whole conglomeration of information, the only thing we can reasonably surmise with any confidence was that Colonel Ledyard didn't receive a sword through the chest from front to back. The vest seems pretty clear on that. Now, the full legend with the combination of the verbal exchange, the surrender, and the sword through the chest appears to have been kind of a product of society as a whole, and that era's strong penchant for patriotism that fully supported embellishment in the name of honor. Ledyard's grave monument with the words "slain with his own sword" was installed in 1854, before even Harris questioned the legend. The last of the survivors were still alive then, and the patriotic tale of Ledyard's killing was still very much alive. So the phrase "with his own sword" may well be true for all we know. It may not seem plausible looking at the vest today, but who can say? The bayonet in battle theory seems believable, but is it believable beyond a reasonable doubt? At the end of the day, actually, does it really matter how Colonel Ledyard was killed? One way or another, he was a loyal patriot, killed in battle, and he remains a hero regardless of how his life ended on Fort Griswold. It seems that times are changing, though, and principal organizations today are now at least publicly recognizing the many questions involved by leaving, kind of their public statements rather vague. The state of Connecticut's online narrative says that the British entered the fort, and at this point, the circumstances become unclear. And Ledyard apparently surrendered and was killed with his own sword. Pointedly, they don't say through the chest, front to back. The Friends of Fort Griswold, even, their online version says that after Colonel gave up his sword in surrender, he was immediately killed. No other details. And a sign on Fort Griswold today describing the Battle of Groton Heights says that when the massacre was finally brought back under control, 88 Americans were dead, including Colonel Ledyard. None mentioned the sword through the chest or the verbal exchange, which is kind of a tacit acknowledgement of the unknowns involved, I think. Some websites, many of which just, as you know, just cut and paste stuff from one place to another, are finally starting to say things like the whole subject is surrounded with some controversy or some vague wording like that. The important thing here is to remember historian George Seymour's words when he said, "Controversy is the fuel which keeps the fires burning on the altar of history. The main job of any group that hopes to support a historic site must be to feed the fires, fan the flames, and to encourage new inquiry into old deeds and demigods. Engagement is what makes people care about a place. It'll take a lot more research and discussion, I think, before we figure this thing out, if we ever do, but I think we've at least indulged the process here tonight. And on that note, I thank you for joining me, and I'd like to thank Mary Howard and the Bill Library for hosting us tonight.